Here we go. Greetings. Welcome everyone to this week's Real Talk with ZSJ. How's everyone doing this evening? I hope everyone is well. Apologies, we're having some technical difficulties. Um, y'all probably can tell I'm not in my usual location. I am traveling this week, and so I'm currently in Arizona, and totally forgot about the time zone change when I scheduled this. So we're earlier. There's tech difficulties, but we're here, and we're still going to have this conversation. I'm excited to welcome Sister Toyo and Brother Talawa. Welcome, y'all. How y'all doing?
Great. Blacktastic to be on a panel with my friend and colleague, and of course, finally, I get to hang out with you, Sister Zakia.
Yeah,
Yes.
the same. Excited to be here. Excited for the conversation tonight, for sure.
Yeah, and this conversation for me is like right on time. I've been hearing or seeing like a lot of chatter, especially on Twitter. I think there was this tweet that both of y'all probably know Brother Torn, based in Atlanta. He did a Twitter Spaces the other day because this brother posted about um, black people, something to the effect of black people thinking that there's only one black experience and that black people in the suburbs exist and all this other kind of stuff. And then so there were a lot of people from the television industry that was a part of his spaces and talked about how it's mainly those type of black people. Now that's their language. I'm not saying that, but it was mainly those type of black people who do a lot of the writing in Hollywood, who make white people feel comfortable. Anyway, all of that stuff. So I was like, I'm glad that we're actually as you know, we already had the schedule. So I'm like, this is kind of like right on time. So yeah. Did y'all see? I don't know. Did you see that? Because I know you're on Twitter about as much as I am, Brother Teller.
I
Did you
don't
see
think
that?
I saw the spaces, but I saw that specific tweet. I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I'll reserve them for discussion.
Right. So cool. I want to just hop right into the conversation, but I wanted to welcome the audience. I see a few people have commented. Welcome. If you all are watching now, drop in the comment where you're watching from, city and state, what country you guys are watching from. Let us know where you all are tuning in from. But I want to hop right into the questions, and both of you can obviously, take a stab at the questions that I will pose to you all. So, music and television are powerful tools of propaganda. Can both of you speak to the programming that specifically targets and promotes this dysfunction to Black people? And Sister Toya, why don't you go first?
Yeah, okay. All right, so let's start with the history of television and
Mm-hmm.
film, right? It
Mm-hmm.
must be mentioned that television and film were racist from the beginning, right?
For
From
sure.
C.W. Griffith's film, The Birth of a Nation, to the blackface on minstrel shows, to the anti-black stereotypes we still see today, like the buck, the brute, the mammy, Jezebel, Sapphire, all these recurring tropes that we see. So if we look closely, television and film have really always been propaganda from its inception, right? And we have to ask, who does this propaganda benefit, and what does the propaganda promote that we're seeing? Because really, if you think about it, television and film are really just an arm used to uphold a white supremacist structure. And the quicker we learn that, the better, for sure. But to answer your question, I think that we can easily pick out anti Black propaganda by looking at the depiction of Black men and the Black family in television and in film. And I say those two because right now we're currently living in this women's empowerment era that brings out a whole bunch of other issues that we can get into later. But seeing this, we're also seeing the shift in the depiction of how Black women are portrayed in media too. So if we look at Black men and the Black family, you'll clearly notice a reinvigoration of old stereotypes that really have existed since the outset of media, right? And I think
Right.
last year, okay, I see you there too. But yeah,
No, all of that, from what I could hear. Again, I'm still having technical difficulties. Remind me of my brother Omar Wally. I see him in the chat. He had these difficulties yesterday trying to do his show. But brother Tao, I wanted to get your thoughts on that too.
Wow, I really had to follow up after Sister Toyo. Wow, this is great. But I will just say very briefly, I think, African people, we're in a situation of cultural suppression by Eurasians, particularly the
Mm-hmm.
pale Eurasians, aka Yorugu, right? Aka Yorugu. So I think within that context, the effect that Eurostream entertainment television, and also you can extend this to film as well, it just reinforces our cultural confusion.
Mm-hmm.
That's just how I see it.
Cultural confusion. It seems like that's the goal,
Right.
to keep people confused. So that to me, I feel like is a good segue into this next question. We've seen a plethora of recent shows that promote Black excellence, which is usually Black folk aiming to transcend Blackness because of some talent, skill, or being the first Black person in a white space. How do you think the promotion of this as something to value affects us in reality?
I guess I'll jump in here.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's a white validation syndrome thing. I think it's very simple. And for those who don't know, white validation syndrome was theorized by Dr. Amma Mazama, right? And she states that it's a form of self-rejection based on the devaluation of our own experiences and the hypervaluation of white people's opinions, right?
Mm-hmm.
This inherent desire to attain whiteness. Because really, that's what the excellence is on these television shows, right? You see the white luxury designer brands, the interracial romantic relationships, the acceptance into white communities, right? That's the excellence they depict so often in the media. So it's really just a white validation thing. Um, so to answer your question, the effects of this promotion can only be more white validation syndrome. That's when we get our kids coming to us asking for perms or asking for Louis Vuitton at age 5 and so on. The problems go on and on. But I think we need to step back and redefine what Black excellence really is and what it should look like on television and film.
I couldn't agree more. There was somebody in the chat that asked if we were accepting questions. Sure, just drop your questions in the
Absolutely.
chat, and I'll ask them at the conclusion of my questions. Brother, I wanted to hear your thoughts. Same question.
It's the same question. I think what you're seeing is, and I talk about this with Brother Omawale, Hotep to Brother Omawale in the chat. We talk about this all the time. And, this Black excellence is a painful reminder about our confusion. I usually refer to this confusion as diversity in Black thought because I don't think diversity is inherently good or inherently bad, but this diversity in political and social thought is reflective of our confusion. So the African people who are usually supporters of Black excellence, usually it's almost always, I have never seen it outside of an integrationist framework. So you're seeing really the epoch of integrationist propaganda through African mouthpieces.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put that. Um, no, I'm gonna leave that alone right now. I was thinking of a follow up question, but I'll come back to that. um, so I've also noticed that these shows are used to normalize liberal politics, especially in regards to gender politics. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Definitely want to start with the sister on this one.
I mean, yeah, let's talk about it, right? Because
Oh yeah.
right, it's so much. I was talking to Brother Amawali as well on his show about the same thing, right? Because we see
I
television.
remember I saw that.
Yeah, okay, because television and film is starting to have the same look now, right? A certain framing that keeps reoccurring, a certain formula that they're selling constantly, and that's being overused. And it usually
Right.
goes like, you have your heroine who has to overcome the antagonist, right? And that person
Mhm.
is usually male, usually a toxic male or a patriarchal institution. And the only way she can overcome it is by relying on sisterhood and on self-empowerment. That's a theme. We've been seeing that with movies, like for any superhero fans, the Captain Marvel and Wonder Woman movies that just came out not too long ago. You can see this over and over, right? So as I did research, I noticed that this formula was not only in white media, right, but also reaching into Black media. And by the way, when I say Black media, I'm just talking about media that stars Black characters for the most part, because that's a whole conversation there.
That's actually what I was thinking about earlier. I was like,
right, so it is Black media, right? That's another conversation. But yeah, so I decided, this is definitely worth investigating further, right? Because we're seeing some kind of phenomenon happening, and I call it feminist propaganda. I keep it, pretty straightforward. So we're clear on where this is coming from, what kind of propaganda it is. And I want to definitely shout out Dr. Valethia Watkins and her theory of compulsory feminism, right? Because she really gave this visibility to this universalization of feminism that has been happening. It's been happening in academia, but also bleeding into media, right? But yeah, so this insertion of feminist propaganda is very real. And there are actually different organizations and research institutes and centers, like the Women's Media Center is one of them, that actively, to this day, fight for feminist media, right? They actually go in and say, this is what we need more of in television and film, and actively fight to put more feminist icons or feminist stories in media that we're seeing. So yeah, we have to stay vigilant to this. We have to teach our kids to stay vigilant. And we can't innocently consume media. We can't afford to.
No, we never have been able to do that. The other thing, just real quick, I wanted to piggyback on that. Not only do they have like feminist writers in these writers' rooms, there also seems to be this additional kind of requirement that they have to be anti-Black male. Because I mean, like, I can hardly stomach some of these new shows because I'm just like, why is the Black man always the enemy? Like, why is the Black man always portrayed in certain types of ways? You know what I mean? And I can't consume it most of the time.
No, because people
don't. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That's such a great point, though. And earlier, with I believe is your first question, I said that it's important for us to look at the depiction of the Black men, right? Because if we look at the depiction of Black women in media right now, we'll be pretty confused because a lot of things seem pretty positive, right? But if you look at the depictions of Black men, you'll see that, they're being demonized. It's the same stereotypes that we've seen since the inception of media that are just being regurgitated to us, right? So it's important to look at how they're depicting men, Black men.
Absolutely. Brother, I want to bring you in. Yeah, come on.
If I can jump in to Sister Toya's point, I love when she explains this because, we're colleagues at Temple, and I've always seen how, her breakdown of media. I'm just sitting like, I've missed that. Since I've been at Temple, I've missed that.
It's a breath of fresh air to hear another sister who has that lens. Because so many sisters don't, especially in higher education.
Oh, woo. That might be a separate conversation. I can get into that. That might be a separate whole
separate. Got a whole nother panel for that.
Right.
I remember when you had Sister Niara on your show and you talked about this, really the absence of Black nationalist women, just running into Black nationalist women. I remember when you said that, it made me think about, Dr. Hudson Weems and being around, Dr. Mazama, and then having to teach students. You're looking at a generation that the only ideological information they're given is intersectional evangelicalism. And when you're an African male in some of these settings, like I'll give you an anecdote of how it's, just to get into the effect point. And I want to get into another point about the liberal politics, and I'll segue into it. You're dealing with a lot of African people who have heavy personal white socialization. I think you know where I'm going with that, so I'll leave it at that. That's important. That even for example, my compliment, my fiance, she's from Philly, right? And she will break down like where students are coming from because she'll sit in the classes and see some of the attitudes. And I remember I was in one class where there was a Yurugu feminazi, and what she tried to turn the class against me because I was explaining the difference between Weems and intersectional evangelicalism. And you know, she didn't like it, obviously, because she didn't like it. But what's interesting, most of the sisters did not agree. Most of my class, is African women. Most of the African women didn't agree, but when I saw my evaluations, and I know which student it was, there's always the one that agrees with the Yorugu and sides with that narrative. So I just wanted to identify that. But bringing it back to the media and the liberalism, another aspect that I'm seeing, and this is what I mean when I start to learn to distinguish African people on an ideological basis, it's like when I see African people, for example, celebrating, Meghan Markle marrying into the British welfare family, you know, I roll my eyes. That
I
just tells
love
you
that
about
British welfare family. That's
their
exactly what they are.
dislocation. So one thing I will notice with some of these films, they will put Black characters in places that don't make sense. So, for example, I'll give an example. One Netflix series, The Witcher, that's set in like a medieval European setting. I know about the Moors and I know all that, but I can tell when they're laying it on. When you're telling me you have some random, they'll throw like a random African person where an African person wouldn't be there, as if they're like an actual British person. And it's these type of, ridiculous assimilationist, retrospective, just pushing integrationist propaganda in an era where there would be any. It's just things like that, and you have a generation of children socialized into believing that. Socialized. So when you're teaching kids, and especially when you're an Afrocentric program like we are, and you're trying to de-whitenize, re-Africanize, it makes it very hard because it's not like the 90s, and I'm sure you, Sister Zakia, and those in your network, those of your generation came into the 90s. The ideological differences between African people were very clear coming into
Right.
college. Now you're growing up with a generation and a certain segment of African people. They just know intersectionality. Like I've heard some people say, you don't even need COINTELPRO. The ideology is in the school.
You don't, right?
You almost don't need. You might need the tip top, but it's like or Karji Woodson's metaphor of the back door. They'll create the back door themselves. So you see that even when students are talking, they're very anti-research and pro whatever they see on the algorithms of liberal social media feeds. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting. But the race bending thing with throwing African characters in positions that don't make sense, or even the bedroom colonialism. For example, I'll take one that isn't on the feminist end, one that this might hurt some people's feelings, but Into the Spider-Verse with Miles Morales, the biracial Spider-Man, right? So you have Miles Morales, right? The only black male characters that he's involved with are one, his father, who, victim of bedroom colonialism to a Latina European woman. And then, his uncle, the Prowler, who's actually has a somewhat of a systematic critique of, the system, right? Though it's never named. He's a criminal, right? The Prowler's a criminal. And then all the women he interacts with, not a single African woman, right? His love interest is a Yorugu. Yep. So I would not have my child consume that in any capacity. This is something, I'm gonna talk about. I would not have any images of bedroom colonialism in our households. I think that's very important to address that very real problem. So you see things like that. So you see the bedroom colonialism. I know Sister Toyo talks about that on the opposite side of the women, but they also do it with the males as well. I don't even think, me and my fiance were talking about this actually just last night. I don't even think we were watching like some of the older 90s sort of shows and films. I'm like, wow, you don't even see black couples anymore.
Yeah.
Right. So it's very much anti-African complementarity. That's how I would explain it. It's just we don't want to see African men and women together doing constructive African things. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I absolutely know what you mean. I want to back up though really quickly because you're using some terminology that I would gander to think that some people watching this may not know what it means. So I want you to define re-Africanization, and also I want you to define bedroom colonialism.
You really want me to define bedroom colonialism, or you just want to hear me talk about it?
I
You
really,
know.
I want people
Okay,
to be
all right.
real clear. No, I'm serious.
Okay.
I want people
No,
to
no,
be
I
real
understand.
clear.
I just check. I don't take myself too seriously, but in terms of, I'll say with re-Africanization, de-Africanization, as Afrocentrists, we know it's not an Afrocentric person is a know-it-all. We're not a
Hmm.
know-it-all of all things Africa, because there's plenty of people who know a lot about Africa and are very Eurocentric, right? It's that
True.
we're engaged in killing the white person inside us. And I think that's very important on a systematic level, killing the white person that's holding back our African consciousness, right? That's the most simplest way I could explain it in terms of the re-Africanization, de-whitenization, because you have to have the two things. It's a simultaneous thing, right? Because again, we're in a systemic cultural suppression by, Eurasians, especially the paler Eurasians. Now, in terms of bedroom colonialism, anytime an African man or an African woman is attracted to a non-African person, and even if it's not to marry, but just even the slightest sexual attraction, that only exists because of conditions of colonialism. Just plain and simple. That doesn't mean that it's not a moral condemnation thing, because so that's why I'm glad you asked me to explain it. But I'm identifying the conditions that cause it. And that's what, yes, I know there have been some great African thinkers who have been victims of bedroom colonialism, but, I can usually tell by reading their writings. If, you're reading from an Afrocentric perspective, there's hints of that. So I would say that, but, I'll leave it there.
No, that's good, and I appreciate you for going into that. Sister Toya, were you trying to get in earlier?
Oh, no. I was just agreeing.
Okay, cool. My next question, this is true. One of my favorite scholars is Dr. Amos Wilson. Yeah, he's my Jagna for real. He always talked about us being controlled by our values. How do you see these shows shifting and inducing a value system that is detrimental to us, especially the youth?
Ooh, that's a good question. Really good and important question at that, because media is not neutral, right? So many people get that confused sometimes and think, it's just entertainment, right? I'm just watching for fun, but it's not neutral. It's really an extension of a particular culture, European culture. So to assume that we can innocently consume this white propaganda, which we've identified already, would just be remiss. And even white scholars know this. If you look in the field of communication, you'll come across George Gerbner, his theory of cultivation theory, right? Which states that the views and behaviors of those who spend more time with media, particularly television, internalize and reflect what they have seen on television. So they know how powerful this is, right? They know that this is just not a neutral territory. And one of my favorite quotes is by Dr. Leonard Jeffries, and he says that, whoever controls the images controls your self-esteem, self-respect, and self-development, right?
Dr. John Henry Clark says something similar too.
He does, yes. So it's very, very important, extremely important. We can't forget that, definitely. I think that's an important question. I'll let Talawa
Absolutely.
go on.
And what would, if you want to speak to go into this maybe a little bit deeper, sister? I guess why would it be in the oppressor's interest to control the value system of the youth?
Hmm. That's a great question, right? I mean, first you have it's a great question. First you have to think about the youth, right? They're training the children because they know that eventually they'll be the adults to teach their kids the same thing, right? So it's a way that they can reinforce and keep the structure going for a longer time, first and foremostly. And it's all about that mind and that mental enslavement and mental captivity that, Dr. Amma Mazama also talks about. I've already mentioned her already, but if you haven't read Afrocentric Paradigm, definitely check that out. But the mind, right? That's really the most crucial form of enslavement. If you can control someone's mind, you control everything about them. If you can control how someone thinks about themselves and their culture, you can control everything. So it's the soft spot. It's a soft spot that many don't think about too, especially when consuming this television and film.
Yep.
It's easy to get in there. It's quick, right? but also it's crucial for us to be aware of this war that's really going on.
That's a fact. You up next, brother?
Well, to Sister Toyo's point, kind of how we came up with the title for our talk. I remember you asked us, to give it a title, and I think this gets to the point of Blackish, a show that I do not like or celebrate in any capacity. And I'll give an anecdote that I think answers your question. So this was around maybe when Blackish had just come out or had just started becoming popular. And I haven't been watching cable television for about maybe 10 years, maybe nearly 10 years. So that's a whole nother conversation, but I know people obviously who watch the show, obviously, so I'm familiar, and I study media now. Professor Toy, one of my influences, into getting me to look more critically into that, definitely. And there was one episode of Blackish where it was Anthony Anderson's character. I guess he's called Dre in the show, and then there was another black male character, and they were basically. And my cousin was watching this. I have a cousin, a young male. African male, of course. And he was watching the show, and I'm always like that family member that talks about racism all the time and being black all the time and gets annoying.
That's
so
me and my family.
I embrace that role, and it's good because I saved him from some bedroom colonialism, because the plantation we're raised in, that's a very, very serious issue. So I don't joke when it comes to that, as you know, you both of you know, but one of the things I observed in the show, so Anthony Anderson and the other black male character are fighting over who can be the go-to black person in the company they work in. And I said to him, and he was saying, well, I can't remember exactly how the dialogue went, but I remember saying something to the effect and saying, you see why I would not have my child watch this show is that notice that these two men, don't you notice they never talked about making their own company to build with other black people? They're fighting over who can be, the go-to Negro, right? That's I used in that exact terminology because I make sure I'm very clear about my terminology with children. I use plantation. I identify who the problem is. I make sure they know Yoruba is always the problem. And if there's an Afro-Saxon, there's a Yoruba always behind them, either in the mind or in the pocket. So, and I think that's very, very important. Sometimes both mind and pocket, you know what I mean? So that's very important. So I said, yeah, they're arguing who can be the token Negro instead of making their own company. And that's quite Blackish indeed. Though I wonder if it should really be Blackish instead of Black Rinsed, but that's a whole nother conversation maybe.
Sitting up here cracking up because the first time I've heard Afro-Saxon was from Baba Nathan and Julia Hare. Remember their book?
Interesting. That is interesting. I stole that from Dr. Kimani Nahusi. There might be a connection there.
I'm sure.
There might be an exchange there.
Yeah. So Dr. Frances Cress Welsing was not the only Black scholar who, obviously loved African people to be ousted from Howard University. Nathan and Julia Hare were as well. I don't know if you knew that history, but yeah.
Yes, I'm very aware of. I won't say too much, but I'm aware of that history.
For sure. But yeah, I thought about them because that's the only other scholarship that I've read that uses the term Afro-Saxon. That's hilarious. But no, I appreciate your analysis of Blackish because I unfortunately know too many people that enjoy that show. Yeah,
it's the hunger for the desperation for representation is part of it, and then sometimes I think it shows the values of what we want. Like I said, when I see African people celebrating Meghan Markle, who I don't consider an African woman, I'm putting that out there.
I don't either.
If I saw her in the club dancing, I wouldn't dance with her. I'm sorry. I have a cultural bias when it comes to dating, clearly. So I don't, but for those who do, that tells me their value system. African people who like Blackish, sometimes it's desperation for representation. Sometimes it tells me something else that they value. It's one
and
of
then the name of the show, Blackish. So
Black
like
rinsing.
just a little bit of black. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And then they had the spinoff, the Mixed Dish.
I knew that was coming.
Yeah, terrible.
And people who are uncritically consuming this stuff, yeah, because I knew that was next. Yeah, that whole mix dish, and then it's gonna be something else after that. But anyway, um, I feel like Dr. Frances Cress Welsing would have so many thoughts on that if she was still with us.
I know.
Already know where I'm going with that.
Yep.
So here's the next question. So most of us, were raised on sitcoms that prioritize Black family and community. Blackness, well, it depends on your age. I'm early 40s, so I'll date myself there. Blackness in and of itself, essentially a character, and it shaped the way we related to each other. Knowing that it's an accident in the system, how do we combat the hijacking of a major pillar of our culture, the Black sitcom? Does it even really exist anymore?
The Black sitcom exists now, but it's important to know what happened, right, in that history. So
Right.
when we look in the 90s, right, we know that African Americans were watching TV at record numbers. Honestly, it was about double the amount of non-Black audiences. That's how much media we were consuming. So some networks, they adjusted to accommodate Black audiences, like UPN, Fox, WB, right? And then other networks, they played it safe and they tried to stay away from Black shows like ABC, NBC, and CBS, which are also known as the big three networks.
Right.
The biggest, essentially. And then we see this drastic erasure of Black sitcoms, and everyone's like, where'd they go? What happened? But a lot of the larger networks actually bought out the smaller ones. So CBS bought out WB and UPN, and they created the CW with Time Warner, leaving only Fox, right?
Okay.
So I think that's important, that history, these mergers, right? It's important to understand how they make these moves. But yeah, so to answer your question, the awareness is key here, right? Because we as a Black community consume the most media, and a lot of people don't know that. And we have to understand that there's actually a power in that if we understand that, right? And we start demanding and creating the right things, which also brings up the point that Talawa had just said about representation, right? So many of us are so caught up on representation and so excited to see more faces on television and in film, because technically that has exponentially increased in media. But it's, when you look at it deeper, you start to question, like, what shows are we actually on, right? A majority of the shows that we're on are these mixed cast shows, or we're sprinkled in somewhere, like shows like This Is Us or Bridgerton, which was popular. I was at the beginning of this year. Everyone was going crazy over that show.
Oh, Bridgerton. Oh, yeah. Black woman as queen. Oh, my God.
Yes.
The white zaddy.
Everyone was so excited about that, right? But when we really look at these shows, what is it actually depicting, right? What are we actually being represented as in these shows, right? So I think it's important for us to learn what I call performative Africanity, which is a lot of what these shows are doing now, which, they're incorporating natural hairstyling. They're giving us an array of complexions that we can look at, all of the little sprinkles, the bells and the whistles, but what and how are we actually being depicted, right? How are these shows censored culturally? Which goes a little bit into Talawa's research, and I'll let him talk more about that. But yeah, in the words of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, I think it's important for us to fight propaganda with propaganda, right? Because he says that we must organize our propaganda to undo the propaganda of other people, and I think that's important for us.
Absolutely.
That's
Come
why.
on in, brother.
I'll be homeschooling my children, and Professor Toy is going to be their propaganda teacher. So I know that I got that at least that's one problem solved. And I just saw the Black Mental Effect. Shonda Rhimes is the devil in a blue dress. I would add, I always describe her programming as plantation fictions. That's a concept.
Y'all coming with the terminology. I love it.
Right. So Shonda Rhimes is a plantation fiction writer or producer, however you want to call it, but the emphasis on plantation fiction, and I'll leave it at that. But in terms of sitcoms, what you're seeing Because I watched a lot of 90s sitcoms and into the early 2000s. And then I saw sort of the Tyler Perryization after like about 2006, 2008. You see that roughly around that time. I think what the difference is between the 90s and let's say you sort of see a kind of hangover transition period, like around the time Monique has the Parkers into Girlfriends with Tracy Ellis Ross, biracial Tracy Ellis Ross, and then some other shows that weren't quite as prominent. And then now you get to Blackish that kind of just blew up in terms of Eurostream media. But there's that transition period before the Blackish era. So now you're seeing a show like Marlon that didn't do well, Upshaws, that's kind of doing very well. Again, has a lot of liberal stuff, getting more promoted than Marlon on Netflix. Not that I like Marlon, I have some issues with it, but just showing you the liberal side of media, the liberal dominance of Eurostream media, that variant. But I think the difference with the 90s, and that's sort of a project I'm working on, the 90s, what you're seeing is Black people being around other Black people and doing things that we know we generally do, which includes our confusion. I have to add that includes our confusion. Whereas I think the shows now are more about Black people teaching white people to understand us. That's more, if I hope I'm making sense with what I'm saying. So the audience isn't, and
No, you
not just
do.
that the audience is white people, but it's Black people who have white friends and intend on keeping those white friends. If you see what I mean, because the thing is, you can't just say, "Oh, this is racist," because remember what we said. Carter G. Woodson, if he cuts out his own back door, in this case, she cuts out her own back door. When you socialize, your children are socialized. That's what happens when we're not consuming media that we control, right? I saw someone in the comments mention that the importance of supporting Black media whenever we can, and also being aware not just independent media but the ideology. I think that's something we don't talk enough about with African people. Not just saying who's revolutionary, who's not, but what is the ideological disposition? Is this a Marxist Black show? Okay, I know what to expect. Is this an Afrocentric, Afro-centered leaning show? This is what I can expect. We have to really distinguish ourselves more on ideological terms. Unfortunately, I wish I could just say everybody's Afrocentric, but I mean, if we were, we wouldn't have to name it, right? That's the
Right.
condition we're in. So with the 90s, though, my only critique of the 90s, and I think you see it being amplified here and later in the concurrent state of sitcoms, is that in the 90s, the way you see how everybody is a hotep now, the pathological hotep. In the 90s, I don't consider In Living Color a sitcom. I know it's a sketch show, but the constant attack on Black consciousness. What I saw that in A Different World. Fresh Prince, I think, was very much a show that was propaganda to support your Afro-Saxon side of the culture wars in the 90s. And I know Zakia, everybody talks about that ideological tension between African people in the 90s, the nationalists and the integrationists. That's really what it always comes down to, right? And at least in the 90s, you saw those ideological differences. But obviously, they were done pejoratively. I think A Different World just told it from an integrationist perspective more so than a pathology. I think that was the unique thing. So, for example, that infamous clip after that Rodney King episode on A Different World, where you have Sister Soldier being Sister Soldier. I love playing in class that clip and then showing when she what she did to Cornell West. Woo, woo. I'm sorry, but that I can never get that out of my head. But that scene in A Different World when she's talking to Whitley, because for me, Whitley and Dwayne are not couple goals. I don't think an African man should entertain a woman like Whitley. If I saw Whitley, she would not. No, that's not for an Afrocentric man, in any capacity. But I understand Black love stuff, but no, not a Whitley. I would never entertain a Whitley, just for the record. But the show has an integrationist perspective, but it shows you that there are African people that think differently. When you get to a show like Blackish, it's just integrationist thinking is just normalized. And what's also normalized is African people not living around other Black people. And this idea of Blackness is not a monolith, I think that's the damn problem. We should be a damn monolith. That's the damn problem. It's out of our confusion that we're not a monolith, right? Because I don't think having a uniform consciousness is a problem. I think, you know, that I just don't. We would get more stuff done if we did, right? In my opinion, right? I think when we say things like, oh, you know, there's not one way to be black, you know, black is not a monolith.
Hate when I hear people
And
say
I
that
always
shit.
say fluid, because you know, with postmodernism, everything is fluid. And I always tell students,
Everything
yeah, I
postmodernism,
always tell
right?
students fluid rhymes with stupid, right? And that's how we should see it, because so you know, so you just start doing, you know, that's what, going back to Blackish, they have these discussions, and I see this in other shows about, you know, justifying their Eurocentric attachments. So justifying living in a Eurasian neighborhood, right? And then justifying debating over microaggressions instead of why you don't have, you know, your own industry. Like, why doesn't Tracy Ellis's Ross character start her own practice for black people to not experience racism? The solution is always trying to get the white person to understand, or, you know, they'd never understand, and oh, we just have some other black people to complain with. It's not a very, it's a very anti-systematic approach to anti-black suppression. So it's just, yeah, but what the only critique I'd say about the 90s is just what I think the 90s did, and it kind of set in stage for a Blackish, was the attack on African consciousness. Anything dealing with African consciousness, whether it be racial militancy, so-called, I use that loosely, racial militancy, because some of the things you and I would not think of as militant, you know, for Afro Saxons, everything is militant, right? But there's also the attack on anything that seems racially militant or with anything to do with cultural consciousness. So I'll give an example from, you know, I'm going to take a shot at one of the shows, unfortunately, I have to say, that I enjoyed, but it was one of the episodes that always made me discomfortable because I kind of developed politics very young. I'll say that. That's part of it. So I always had this kind of ambivalence with television for, you know, for obvious reasons. There's an episode where Carlton is trying to join a frat. Will and Carlton are both trying to join a frat. It's Fresh Prince, right? I don't know if this episode is ringing bells, but Carlton, the frat did not want Carlton. They wanted Will, right? But they didn't want Carlton. And Carlton, you know, finds out, and then, you know, they have this argument where Carlton is saying, you know, it doesn't matter if I listen to Barry Manilow. It doesn't matter if I wear a suit. I'm still black
I
like you,
remember that.
right? And then everyone's clapping. And how I teach students, because one of the things we do is when we're teaching students, you know, to be Afrocentric, it's how do you look at this media from an Afrocentric perspective? Well, one, you can tell that this film or this episode has an integrationist underpinning, right? Because it makes blackness simply a victim. Blackness is defined by being a victim of color prejudice, even though that's a situation we're dealing with, even though it's much more than color prejudice, obviously. We're dealing with Yoruba domination, right? It's not critiquing, we're not asking, why does Carlton even like Barry Manilow? Right, because I'll tell you, for now, I research. I don't play no white artists in our household. There's no reason, especially with music of all things. That's the most accessible thing. We have no excuse to be playing Eurasian music. There's none, especially music of all things. There's no reason. That means there's confusion. Look where Uncle Phil chooses to live. Look at who he chooses to associate. That's socialization. But again, when you're an integrationist or an assimilationist, you could even make the argument, you're not going to want to show that. You're not even going to want to have that even for debate. You see what I mean? So that's kind of the issue with the 90s sitcoms, is you saw those debates, but they were often from an integrationist perspective. They didn't mind black social culture, like when we're, you know, we're talking black or we're doing black things socially, but when it gets into that political realm, right, that's kind of like the predecessor to the Hotep pathology we see now. And I saw that in one of the shows I was talking about. This with Sister Toy, a black lady sketch show, more like a Negress sketch show, if you ask me. They had the whole Hotep, and I'm not a defender of Tariq Nasheed. I have some issues with him, but their critique is based on, you know, some sort of liberal pathology of anything that isn't feminist.
Exactly.
Right. So I'm always careful about the terms. Just because they're critiquing someone I critique, the reasons are totally different.
That's right. No, I appreciate that. That was very thorough, and you brought up a lot of good points in that that part of the Fresh Prince. I remember that episode. I really do, and to me, that set the stage for basically everything that we see now. It's a watering down um, of blackness, like what, like you said, especially of the nationalists. type of leaning. And not only that, I remember when the whole like derogatory. I remember when people turned Hotep into a slur. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and it started on social media.
Yep.
I couldn't believe it. I was like, "What the fuck?" I was like, "What is happening?" I was literally confused. I'm like, "Why are people doing this?" And then when I started seeing why they were calling people Hotep, I was like, "Oh, I'm Hotep." You know, I'm like, "Y'all talking about me?"
And it's just to add to Talawa's point too, it's just crazy how often we're seeing it in news shows now too, right? Because
Yep. Oh, girl, white people are saying it. And I'm like, really?
Yes, I'm like, this is not, stop.
I mean, what
Right.
did I say about the right friends? We see it
Right.
in our classes all the time, the liberalization of the African mind in the university. Because, the
Yeah.
university is the secular church.
Ooh, damn. Yeah, I can see that. I
It
had a
is.
hard time when I was in the university, a very
I could
hard time. And
imagine.
I remember being in a women and gender studies class, and I constantly got into it with a white feminist professor. And now this was like I was nowhere near as politicized as I am now, because this is years ago. Like I said, I'm in my early 40s. So, but I remember even back then, like what you're describing. I remember telling her, "This is not my experience, and it's not the experience of most women that I know, most women that I grew up with. I grew up in the American Southeast in Alabama. We do not hate our men.
Right.
Like, I don't know." And I remember that our interactions were so often because I couldn't help but to challenge a lot of the things that she was standing up there in front of the class teaching. And I remember there was another sister in the class. And somebody was talking while I was talking. She was like, "Be quiet, man. I want to hear what she's saying." So I was having an influence on the other students in the class
Wow.
because no, serious, because most of the time, when you go to school, most people ain't. I would say my experience when I was in college, most of the people that I was in school with, because I was a little older, weren't as serious as I was at the time. And so people would just go like, "Okay, I need to get this grade and get out of here. I'm not thinking about this shit that deep." And so for me, it was that deep. You know what I'm saying? And so I would challenge. And I remember that's when I found out everything was political, because that professor, we had I remember in that class the way that she gave tests was essay form. So I would be going in. I would be like, "Oh, I can't wait for the test." You know what I'm saying? So I'm like, and I would have so much on my paper, and I would look at like my classmates, see, how everybody else was doing. And I remember that lady gave me a C in that class. If she would have failed me if she felt like she could have really got away with it. But and I remember, like, I know damn well that I gave much more input into this class than a whole host of other people. And I remember thinking, like, okay, so basically if you're a woman but you don't think, what I mean, just like you, and you don't hate men, especially black men, then you ain't going nowhere in the university.
Yeah.
And I learned that 12, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
You know,
Still the same. Hasn't changed.
and I think
Yeah.
that's why, to your point, I think because at Temple, I think with the presence of, between Dr. Asante and Dr. Mazama having clear ideology, because sometimes in Africana studies, Black studies, whatever, we're afraid of ideological commitments. And what
Mm.
happens is this allows a lot of infiltration. So what happens is people oftentimes come into Black studies just to talk about Black people, but there's different ideologies. Like when I looked at different Africana studies programs, I looked at ideology because, like I said, I had an understanding. Look, if this program doesn't have my ideology, I'm not working. I'm like that. But I realized when most people are coming into Black studies, I talk about people, Black people. So why is it not Afrocentric? So you would see some students who were feminist evangelicals, and not saying that feminism is
Not not
anything
not
for.
feminist evangelicals though.
Oh yeah, they
Hey,
are. They
you
are. It's a
killing
sect.
me with this
Yeah,
terminology. I'm using
And
it
hear what I
all.
said. The set is a liberal secular church. Okay, that's what it is. All it is. You know what the paradigm is? Because I had this conversation even with Dr. Curry. Because I remember I'd fret after certain classes. I see. I won't might not be the specific, but a lot of it is the BMAS paradigm. Black men ain't shit. That's all it is. Feminist it's a way to intellectualize that, and that's all it ever comes down to. I remember being in a class reading Baba Imoju Akinyele's work about We Will Shoot Back, and I remember one evangelical. Um, she would do every class we're reading a book, all she would say is, well, there must have been the black men with guns, there must have been some of them killing the woman, and all this kind of foolishness. And it would just be not even doing the readings, in the seminar, not even read a lick up, not even read a word on a page, but insist that that's how much this thing was. It was to weaponize or to intellectualize around their Afrophobia towards African men. That's what it is. That's really what it is. Because we've even been in student discussion groups, and I remember one time in one discussion group, it was, and this is in the university space, because sometimes some of our children are in this space, so I explain it that way. I explained that the discussion got so heated about what black men don't do. I said, well, you know what? We have to also talk about anti-African, anti-black misandry that women have, because if you're on a plantation, how could one half of the community be colonized and the other half not? That doesn't make sense.
Come
It's
on.
like when I see silly arguments, like when Serena fell victim to bedroom colonialism, and I remember seeing some tweets, claiming that African men didn't like Serena, which is, I did a research paper all on that, about that's, well, it was implicated in that paper that that's a bunch of crap. That's the first thing. But the second thing was, I remember seeing tweets like, oh, well, when black women are with white men, they're a little more race conscious. So I said, oh yeah, yeah, they can talk about white privilege while, I don't know how vulgar I can be on here, but they talk about white privilege while it's all up in their bedroom, though. You can talk all about it, right? But
Talk
what's the
about it.
point, right? But you see those kind of things, and even seeing a student, a young female student, when the so-called interracial relationship discussions, and this is in a student club conversation that I observed with a colleague of mine. One student even said, and this goes to the whole blackish or black rinsing phenomena, where she said, I don't like when I have to date that I have to think about the race every time I date. And this is
Where
this
these
is what I
Negroes
mean.
come from?
Yeah,
I
exactly.
don't
And,
get
and
it.
and that's very
This
scary.
must be these. They is it like 1995? And
Are
I
you talking
mean,
about
some.
Gen Z? Gen
Yeah,
Z?
I'm
it's
like, what
it's
is happening?
it's strong. It's very strong. So the impact that the media has, and those stuff, that's not a joke. That is definitely not a joke.
No, it's definitely not.
Yeah.
I gotta tell y'all, I feel like we really need to have a part two to this, because I actually have to wrap here in a minute or two, because as y'all know, I'm out of town, and I'm at this resort, and I got an appointment coming up. Um, the Mr. Jabbar just sent me a text message like, "Don't forget." But this has just been so fun. Like, I really want to bring both of y'all back. This is because
Okay, let's
I,
do it.
Let's do
I'm
it. I'm
serious.
down.
The level of teaching that y'all were doing, that's why I wanted you to like explain, because the re-Africanization gonna happen on Real Talk with ZSJ.
Yeah.
Because people ain't never heard these terms, man. They're not hearing this in their university, only at Temple,
Definitely.
and
And I'll
maybe a
say
few
that.
other.
I think, and to your point, Sister Z, if I wasn't, because I'd always been engaged in Afrocentricity from afar, but I
Yeah.
think if that type of and this goes to institution question, if we didn't have that institutional space, we probably would have had to compromise a lot of the things we say,
Wow.
or some of that
Yeah.
my own de-whitenization would not be able to happen. You know,
Yeah.
to be quite frank with you. So that institutional question, I know Baba Amos Wilson is big on that aspect too. The
Yes.
institution. This gets back into, to me, how we're socializing our children. We have to
That's right.
really again get into ideology and the relationship between
Right.
ideology and socialization.
I hear that you all have a new graduate student that's starting or has started, Feminista Jones.
Well, I've graduated, so
Oh,
Toya
okay.
can maybe give more insight on that. I
Yeah.
graduated, so
I was shocked. That's all I'll say. And like I said, we don't have to really get into that tonight because I don't know the politics of the university and I ain't trying to get nobody in trouble, but I was shocked. And then when I found out like the research that she wants to do to get her PhD.
oh, so you're
So
so basically part two. We just gotta set a date.
yeah, part
All
two.
right.
And I feel like the audience has been really engaged. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to really see a lot of it because of my tech issues. But I will be back home in Maryland for the next one. So yeah, we'll set a date and have you all come back because yeah, y'all do a lot of good teaching and I appreciate
Just
it.
want to add too. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
conversations like this are so important because this propaganda is designed so that we can't really destruct it or not really notice what's actually happening, right? It's created in a hidden way. So
Right.
conversations like this are crucial so that we can go ahead and teach our community how to think critically about what we're consuming, what kind of questions to ask, what perspective we should be looking at it from, which is
That's right.
absolutely so. This is important, and I'm here for round two for sure.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad to hear that. And thankfully, Google, Alphabet, whatever the company is that own YouTube, they are not censoring this information yet. So we got to hurry up and get it done before they start
Yes.
censoring.
Basically,
Right.
I've observed that.
Right, right. They're not censoring it yet. Although I feel like my page has been kind of like shadowed a little bit, you know,
I
because
can
if
see
you
that
see
on
it,
Facebook
Right.
too, because my fiance,
yeah.
she was saying she was missing some of your posts.
Yep.
Oh yeah, they
She
shadow ban
actually
me on
mentioned you.
Facebook.
You know my fiance. She always comment on your
She
stuff.
always, yeah,
Always
exactly.
stuff. And sometimes she's like, sometimes I'm not seeing Sister Zakia's posts. I'm like,
Yep.
Oh yeah,
crack a book.
yeah, yep,
Yeah.
yep. So yeah, I've been a victim of 2 Facebook jailings within the last 6 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, so it's a mess. See, that's why we need to create our own YouTube, y'all.
Yeah,
Please.
that's why I think that's why it's so important. What I think Ukunini, Obadile, Kambon, and the folks at
Yes,
BB Tumi. I think that's what they've done with social media for African people who want to be African with a capital
yeah,
A, has been so impactful. That's also an awesome platform. I definitely
for
recommend
sure.
Afrocentric folks check that out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank y'all so much. This was so much fun. Definitely round two coming up. We'll circle back and set a date. And the topic, 'cause I felt like there were like 2 or 3 things. We was like, yeah, we can have a whole nother show on that. So we're gonna have to like huddle up over email and figure out like which topic we'll go. We'll dive deep into next time. But this has been very fun. Apologies to the audience. I know I had some tech issues in the beginning. But thank you for your patience. And I will see you all next week, same place, same time, Wednesday, 8 p.m. every Wednesday. I will be back home in Maryland, so hopefully I won't have any tech issues. But next week's topic is very heavy. I will actually be interviewing a sister who was a victim of eugenics. She was sterilized by the state of North Carolina.
Oh shit.
She received reparations from the state of North Carolina within the last 5 years. So I will be interviewing that sister and we'll be talking about um, that type of anti-Black biological terrorism that has been visited on our people, especially Black women. So hopefully, y'all who are listening, mark that down in your calendar to join and listen to her from her own words. Thanks, everybody. Y'all have a good evening. Take care.
All
Thank
right,
you.
later.
Thank
Till
you.
next time.
Till
See
next time. Thanks, y'all. Peace.